It's just after midnight, April 11, 1241. The air on the banks of the Sejo River is so cold it feels like glass, sharp and brittle in the lungs. In the suffocating darkness, you don't hear an army, not in the way a European king would understand it. There is no clank of plate armor, no rumble of heavy-wheeled carts. There are only whispers, carried on the frigid breeze. The groan of wet wood under strain. The creak of stiff, frozen leather. The muffled, percussive thud of mallets striking rawhide, stretching it over a makeshift pontoon bridge. And beneath it all, a sound so vast and yet so subtle it becomes a part of the silence, the soft, steady breathing of 150,000 horses. Their breath plumes in the blackness, a forest of rising ghosts. They stand patiently, heads bowed, some pawing at the frost-covered ground for a last, meager meal. This isn't an army preparing for battle. It's a tide of flesh and hunger, a biological phenomenon poised to swallow a continent. Orchestrating this silent symphony of invasion is a man named Subutai. He is not a king. He does not cut a heroic figure. He is old, past 60, grossly overweight, his eyes nearly lost in a landscape of weathered flesh. He has to be carried from place to place in a specially designed wagon. But from that humble seat, his mind, honed by 50 years of relentless warfare, sees the world with a clarity no emperor could match. He doesn't see the kingdom of Hungary. He doesn't see borders, or fortresses, or even the rushing, icy river in front of him. He sees pastures. He sees fuel. Because his army, this living wave of men and beasts, is about to do the impossible. They have crossed the continent without a single supply wagon trailing behind them. Their food, their transport, their shelter, their siege power, it's all standing right here in the dark, quietly converting frozen grass into kinetic energy. Tonight, a bridge will fall. An empire, and the very idea of European chivalry, will be shattered. And the world will be forced to learn a terrifying new kind of math. What happens when an army doesn't just march on the road, but eats it? What happens when your engine runs on grass? To truly comprehend how Subutai is about to break the spine of European resistance, you have to dismantle and inspect the machine he commands. Forget the swords, the lances, the terrifying composite bows for just a moment. The single deadliest weapon in the entire Mongol arsenal is a 13-hand-high, shaggy, barrel-chested, and impossibly tough creature, the steppe horse. This is not the magnificent, towering destrier of a European knight, a creature bred for the shock charge of the jousting list. That animal is a specialist, a fragile and expensive piece of military hardware that requires high-quality grain, careful grooming, and frequent rest. It is a weapon for the battlefield. The Mongol horse is the battlefield. It is a biological miracle, a four-legged engine of conquest perfected by millennia of natural selection on the world's harshest proving ground. It can survive on almost nothing, using its hooves to paw through a foot of snow to find the dried, nutrient-rich grass beneath. Its metabolism is a marvel of efficiency, its heart and lungs oversized for its frame, allowing it to maintain a steady, ground-eating trot for days on end. It can find water where there seems to be none and endure temperature swings that would kill any other domestic animal. And most critically, it turns the very landscape into propulsive energy. Every other organized army in the world, from the Roman legions to the Crusader states, was chained to its supply lines. An army's speed was dictated not by its soldiers, but by the lumbering pace of the ox-drawn carts carrying grain and hay. A general could only advance as far as his logistical tether would allow. The Mongols severed that chain completely. Their army was the supply line. Let's really dig into the numbers, because this is where the strategic genius becomes so stark it's almost blinding. A typical Mongol cavalry wing, a tumen of 10,000 men, was accompanied by at least 40,000 horses. Each rider had a string of 3, 4, or even 5 remounts. This wasn't a luxury, it was a core tactical doctrine. A warrior would ride one horse into the ground, then leap onto a fresh one, keeping the column moving at a relentless pace. For Subutai's invasion force of roughly 50,000 warriors, that meant a staggering herd of at least 200,000 horses. Now, let's calculate the fuel requirement for this biological machine. An average horse needs about 10 kilograms, or 22 pounds, of dry forage a day. For 200,000 horses, that's 2 million kilograms, 2,000 metric tons of grass, every single day. To put that in perspective, that's the equivalent of clear-cutting over 3,000 football fields of grazing land, from dawn until dusk. Carrying that amount of fodder is not just difficult, it is a mathematical and physical impossibility. So they didn't. The landscape had to feed them. And this one simple fact inverted the entire logic of medieval warfare. A Hungarian king looked at his map and saw fortifications, choke points, defensible river lines. He saw obstacles. Subutai looked at the same map and saw a fuel chart. The Great Hungarian Plain, the Alfold, was not a battlefield, it was a massive, open-air fuel depot. The river meadows along the Danube, the Tisza, and the Sejo were not just geographical features, they were service stations, pre-planned stops on a carefully calculated route of consumption. Subutai's invasion of Hungary in the spring of 1241 wasn't a march, it was a finely tuned grazing schedule. His scouts, spies, and envoys, sent years in advance under the guise of diplomacy, weren't just mapping enemy troop concentrations. They were performing ecological reconnaissance. They were mapping pastures. They noted which fields had been burned by retreating locals, where the spring grass would rise greenest and first. The timing of the entire multi-pronged invasion of Europe, a pincer movement across Poland and Hungary, was calibrated to arrive with the vernal bloom. The Mongol army was a migratory predator, and its migration was timed to the life cycle of its fuel source. And this predator moved at a speed that bordered on supernatural to its victims. With fresh horses to switch to, a Mongol column could cover 80 to 120 kilometers, 50 to 75 miles, in a single day, for weeks on end. On a forced march, they could push that to 160 kilometers, 100 miles. They didn't just outfight their enemies, they outpaced the very fabric of reality. News of their approach didn't precede them, it arrived simultaneously with the first volley of arrows falling upon your unsuspecting sentries. This system, this grass-fueled engine of conquest, was more than just the horse. It was a trinity of devastating efficiency. The horse was the hardware. But equally important was the software, the organization of the Mongol army and the warrior who rode it. Every man was a herdsman from birth. They learned to ride before they could walk, becoming one with their mounts. Their primary weapon, the composite bow, was a marvel of engineering, laminated from horn, sinew, and wood, capable of launching armor-piercing arrows with lethal accuracy from the saddle. This was not the clumsy archery of European armies, this was a fluid, 360-degree storm of death delivered at a gallop. Their entire society was structured for war. The decimal system, units of 10, Arban, 100, Jag Hun, 1000, Mingan, and 10,000, Tuman, created a brutally efficient, scalable structure. It could break apart into dozens of independent raiding swarms to pillage and terrorize the countryside, then coalesce in a matter of hours into an overwhelming, unified mass for a decisive battle. But you have this incredible machine of speed and devastation, spread across 1,000 miles of territory. How do you command it? How do you coordinate a pincer attack on a continental scale when your generals are weeks apart? You can't just wait for a horse to graze its way across an empire with a message. So, the Mongols didn't just perfect a military engine, they built a biological internet. It was called the Yam. The Yam was a vast, empire-spanning network of relay stations, strategically placed every 25 to 40 kilometers along major routes. These stations were manned and stocked by the local populace, a compulsory and often brutal tax. A rider carrying an urgent dispatch, an order from the Great Khan, or a vital piece of intelligence, would gallop into a Yam station, day or night, rain or snow. He wouldn't rest. He wouldn't even dismount his own tired horse. He would present his peza, a metal tablet of authority that gave him absolute priority, and a fresh, waiting horse would be brought to him. He would leap from one saddle to the next, perhaps grabbing a piece of dried meat or a skin of fermented milk, and be gone in a cloud of dust within minutes. A message traveling on the Yam system could cross 200, even 300 kilometers in a single day. When the great Khan Ogdi died in the capital of Karakorum in Mongolia, the news reached Subutai and Battle Khan on the doorstep of Vienna in just 4 to 6 weeks. For comparison, a similar message in Europe might take 4 to 6 months. This was a nervous system of horsepower that made the empire think, react, and strike as one terrifyingly cohesive organism. So there you have it, the Trinity of Conquest. An army that runs on grass, organized for maximum speed and lethality, and connected by the fastest communications network on Earth. This terrifying combination wasn't an invention of Genghis Khan or Subutai in the 13th century. This was merely the perfection of a partnership, a way of life, that was thousands of years in the making. If we pull on this historical thread, it takes us back in time, far beyond any written record. We travel to the windswept plains of northern Kazakhstan, around 3500 BCE, to the archaeological sites of a people we now call the Botai. For years, archaeologists digging at their ancient settlements found something perplexing. They found horse bones, tons and tons of them. This wasn't unusual for a hunting culture. But they also found pottery with a strange, ghostly sheen on the inside. When a team of archaeochemists analyzed these residues, they found the unmistakable chemical fingerprints of dairy fats. Specifically, mare's milk. Alongside this, paleodentists examining horse teeth from the sites found telltale beveling and wear on the premolars, a specific damage pattern caused by a bit. The Botai people weren't just hunting horses for meat. They were herding them, milking them to make a nutritious drink like kumis, and, most importantly, riding them, 5,500 years ago. This was the dawn of the partnership. This was the revolutionary moment a human being looked at this wild animal and saw not just a meal, but a machine. A biomechanical engine that could turn the inedible, ubiquitous grass of the steppe into high-protein milk, life-saving meat, and, most critically, motion. The core software of the Mongol invasion, the very idea of a human-equine partnership for mobile living, was written here, on these plains, millennia before Subutai was ever a glimmer in the eye of his ancestors. Now, let's put that ancient, perfected system to the ultimate test. Let's pit the grass engine against the greatest military machine of the ancient world. Let's pit the logic of the steppe against the logic of the city. Let's pit it against Rome. The year is 53 BCE. The place is Carrhae, a dusty, sun-blasted patch of desert in modern-day Turkey. The players, Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, a member of the first triumvirate with Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. He is driven by a burning, all-consuming ambition to match the military glory of his partners. To achieve this, he has led 7 legions, nearly 40,000 of the world's most disciplined, heavily armored infantry, into Parthian territory. His opponent, a mysterious Parthian general known only as Surina, commanding a force of just 10,000 horsemen. Crassus was the living embodiment of Roman arrogance. He believed his legions were an unstoppable force of nature, a grinding machine of shield and sword that could conquer any terrain. He marched them straight into the flat, open desert, seeing it as the perfect place to deploy his superior numbers. He fundamentally misunderstood the landscape because he was chained to the logic of grain. His men marched on rations they carried with them. When those ran out, he would need to capture a city or wait for a supply convoy. His army's operational range was a function of its stomach. Surina's army ran on the sparse, tough desert grass. His force consisted of 9,000 horse archers, lightly armored and mounted on agile ponies, and a corps of 1,000 cataphracts, terrifying heavy cavalry, with both man and horse encased in scale armor. Surina understood the desert. It was not an obstacle, it was his greatest weapon. As the Roman legions formed their dense infantry square, the battle began. The Parthians didn't charge. They swarmed. The horse archers rode in circles around the Roman formation, just outside the range of a Roman javelin, firing a ceaseless storm of arrows from their powerful composite bows. The Romans formed their famous testudo, a turtle shell of overlapping shields. But the Parthian arrows were heavy and strong, capable of punching through shields and pinning a soldier's foot to the ground. The noise was a constant, demoralizing hiss. Crassus, confident in his Roman superiority, made a fatal assumption: eventually, they'll run out of arrows. But then, behind the swirling Parthian lines, the Roman soldiers saw a sight that broke their spirit and shattered their understanding of war. A train of camels, hundreds of them, their packs laden not with water or food, but with massive bundles of arrows. Surina had brought his ammunition resupply with him. His logistics were as mobile and relentless as his army. The horse archers would exhaust their quivers, ride back to the camel line, resupply, and return to the fight without a pause. They employed the famous Parthian shot, feigning retreat only to twist in the saddle and fire a final, lethal arrow over their horse's rump. The Roman legionaries could do nothing but stand there and die, baking under the desert sun in their heavy armor. In a desperate move, Crassus sent his son, Publius, with a force of cavalry to drive the Parthians off. The horse archers immediately feigned a panicked retreat, luring Publius and his men far from the main Roman force. Once isolated, the trap was sprung. The cataphracts, who had been waiting patiently, charged. The clash was brutal. The Roman cavalry, exhausted and outmatched, was annihilated. Publius was killed. The Parthians impaled his head on a spear and paraded it in front of the main Roman army to complete their psychological destruction. The battle was a massacre. The Roman legions, the greatest infantry machine of their time, were immobilized, pincushioned, and crushed. They couldn't close the distance. They were a grain-powered army trapped and dismantled in a grass-powered world. Crassus was defeated not by better soldiers, but by a superior energy system. His end was legendarily grisly, captured and executed, with the Parthians said to have poured molten gold down his throat, a gruesome mockery of his infamous greed. So is the grass engine invincible? If you can turn the very landscape into fuel, if you can move with the speed of rumor, can anything possibly stop you? The answer is yes. And the blueprint for defeating the unstoppable Mongol tide was written not in a European castle, but in the dust of Palestine, at a place called Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, in the year 1260. The Mongol army, this time under a brilliant general named Kibuka, had swept through Persia and Syria, sacking Baghdad and Damascus. They stood at the gates of Egypt, poised to extinguish the last great center of Islamic power. Their opponents were the Mamluks of Egypt, a unique military society. The Mamluks were, in origin, slave soldiers, mostly of Turkic or Circassian origin from the Eurasian steppe. They were bought as boys, rigorously trained in the arts of war, and formed a loyal military elite. Their sultan, Kutuz, and his most brilliant general, Baybars, were themselves former slaves who had risen through the ranks. And this was their crucial advantage: they were men of the steppe. They knew the Mongol playbook because they had been raised in the same school of warfare. They knew the Mongol machine's greatest strength was also its single greatest vulnerability: it had to eat. Baybars understood that to defeat the Mongols, you didn't fight their army, you fought their logistics. Instead of meeting Kipuka's army in an open plain where their mobility would be decisive, Baybars did something far more clever. He chose the battlefield, a relatively narrow valley in Palestine, near the critical water source of Ain Jalut. For weeks leading up to the battle, he had his Mamluk forces engage in a scorched earth campaign, systematically burning the surrounding pastureland. He denied the Mongol horses their fuel. Then, using the classic Mongol tactic of a feigned retreat against them, Baybars led a small vanguard to bait the overconfident Kipuka. Believing it to be the entire Mamluk army, Kipuka charged headlong into the valley. The main Mamluk army, under Sultan Kutuz, was hidden in the surrounding hills. Once the Mongols were fully inside the kill box, the trap was sprung. Mamluk cavalry poured down from the hills, sealing the valley entrance and surrounding the Mongol force. The Mongol horses were already tired, hungry, and thirsty from the lack of pasture. The Mamluks, fighting on home turf, had access to local remounts and short, secure supply lines. In the close confines of the valley, Mongol mobility was neutralized. The battle devolved into a brutal, close-quarters slugging match, a type of fight the Mamluks excelled at. For the first time in a major pitched battle, the Mongol tide was not just stopped, it was shattered. Kipuka was captured and executed. The myth of Mongol invincibility was broken. Ain Jalut proved the fundamental rule of the grass engine. It only works when there's grass. Deny it pasture, force it into terrain where it cannot swarm and maneuver: the dense forests of Germany, the swamps and rice paddies of Vietnam, the mountainous terrain of Japan, and the engine stalls and dies. This same ecological logic shaped not just battles, but the very structure of societies. Think again about that iconic image of the European medieval knight. Where did that entire social and military system come from? Many historians argue that it was kickstarted by a simple piece of technology, which, like the Mamluks, also originated on the steppe: the stirrup. The stirrup, spreading west with nomadic peoples like the Avars, was a revolutionary device. It allowed a rider to brace himself securely in the saddle, effectively fusing man and horse into a single, cohesive weapon system. It enabled the use of a long, heavy lance in a couched position, delivering the full momentum of a charging horse through a single iron point. This was the birth of shock cavalry. But this new weapon system was incredibly expensive. You needed a bigger, stronger horse, the destrier. You needed heavy iron armor. You needed years of specialized training. How does a pre-industrial society pay for that? A solution emerged across Europe and the Near East: you grant the warrior a parcel of land. A fief in Western Europe, a timar in the Ottoman Empire. That land, with its pastures, forests, and peasant labor, supports the knight and his warhorse. Feudalism, in this sense, is a political system designed to solve a logistical problem: how to feed the horses. The very structure of society, with its lords and vassals, was welded to the pasture. The pattern, once you see it, is undeniable, written across centuries and continents. An army is, at its core, an energy system. Those armies that can convert the landscape directly into motion will always outpace those chained to depots and wagons. The Mongols were the absolute, undisputed masters of this principle. They didn't just practice warfare, they weaponized ecology. Their entire empire was a finely tuned machine for turning grass into speed, and speed into conquest. It was a victory of the trinity of the steppe. First, the biological engine, the hardy steppe horse and the deadly composite bow. Second, the organizational weapon, the decimal system, the remount doctrine, the psychological terror. And third, the nervous system of empire, the YAM relay network that allowed them to think and command faster than any rival. The true turning point in understanding this history, the moment of revelation, is realizing that their greatest conquests were not simply victories of arms, but victories of logistics. And their greatest defeats, in the valleys of Palestine, the jungles of Vietnam, the shores of Japan, were not military failures, but ecological failures. They were the moments the grass engine was starved of its fuel. Because there is a profound and inescapable cost to this speed. An army that lives off the land can move like lightning, but it struggles to govern. An empire that races across the grass must eventually stop to build cities, to administer justice, to collect taxes in something other than plunder. And the moment you stop, the moment you become sedentary, your hoof advantage begins to rust. The Mongol Yuan dynasty in China, under Kublai Khan, became a Chinese dynasty. They built a fixed capital, developed a bureaucracy, and adopted the slow, methodical ways of a grain-based empire. The grass engine had been put in a garage, and in doing so, the very thing that made them Mongols began to fade. Do not fool yourself into thinking this is ancient history. This is a fundamental law of power, and we are still living in its shadow. The Mongol script was rehearsed, almost note for note, in the 20th century. Germany's blitzkrieg in World War II was a steppe invasion powered by gasoline. Heinz Guderian's panzer divisions were the new Mongol cavalry, fast, hard-hitting, and capable of deep penetration. And their success depended entirely on their supply lines, the fuel trucks that became the new, vulnerable umbilical cord. When those fuel lines stretched too thin on the vast, pasture-like plains of the Soviet Union, on the road to Moscow, the engine sputtered and died. Today, the grass has changed its form, but the principle remains exactly the same. The pasture is now the energy grid, the oil pipelines, the lithium mines that feed our batteries, the satellite bandwidth that carries our data. A stealth drone that sips battery power and can loiter for days over a target is the new steppe pony, living off a different kind of forage. An army that can dominate the electromagnetic spectrum, blinding its enemy and protecting its own communications, is the new master of the open plain. Control the flow of energy and information, and you control the pace and outcome of any conflict. The borderlands of the Eurasian steppe, the river meadows of Ukraine, these are still the world's great energy and grain corridors, the geostrategic pastures that modern empires fight to control. Strategy, now as it was then, is just ecology with a flag. The final verdict? History teaches us a brutal lesson. If you want to understand power, don't just look at the kings and the battles. Look at what they ate. Look at their fuel source. Look at the engine that drove them. Because if your enemy is the one who eats the road, you don't build a wall to stop them. You burn the pasture. We investigate this deep connection between landscape and power every day. If you want to be the first to see our next investigation, subscribe and turn on notifications. And now, a question for the comments. The Mongols turned grass into an empire. Today, what is the grass that fuels modern power? Is it oil? Data? Microchips? Let me know your one-word answer down below. And after you've commented, check out the video on the end screen. It's another deep dive into the hidden engines that drive our world. See you there.